Perfect. So let me do a quick introduction. I was planning on doing a little presentation on this research that comes out of Stanford, which is on gas stoves and benzene emissions, but we are very lucky that we have the lead researcher with us here today to present to you all about their findings. So we have with us Yannai Kashtan, who is a PhD student at Stanford University, and he has a background in physics and chemistry. So is really a true expert in the emissions that are coming from our gas stoves. And he is going to be presenting a brand new study to us. They've done a little bit of a press tour and already have some great slides put together. And I think we might have a couple of other folks from RMI, from my team and Anna Sophia's team, who might join us here in a second as well, because they were interested in hearing what you had to say. But I think we'll turn it over to you for about 15 minutes. And then folks, if you have any questions, hopefully Yannai has a little bit of time to answer those for us. And I've made you a co-host already, so you can go ahead and take the reins whenever you're ready.
Great. Emma, thanks so much for inviting me. Happy to share some of our findings. Hi, everybody. So I'll share slides in a second. I'll just say, first of all, the material I'm sharing here is material that you can find pretty easily in either the press or in the paper itself. So I'm going to go relatively quickly, try not to take too much time, and I think, you know, mostly would be interested in answering specific questions that folks have. Let me go ahead and share and present. Can folks see everything okay?
Yeah, it's looking great.
Great. Okay. So as some of you may know, we just published a study a couple of weeks ago demonstrating that gas and propane combustion in stoves emits benzene and thereby increases indoor air pollution. This was a collaboration between both myself and some colleagues at Stanford and PSC Healthy Energy. There's some background slides that I often share. I know, you know, I'm speaking to a pretty well-informed audience, so I'll share those at the end if we have time and interest, but I'll just jump right into the findings so that we can get into the meat of this particular study. The first main area, we looked at emission rates. So how much benzene in micrograms per minute is being emitted by a burner or an oven per unit time. And we tested induction, hobs, the old school coils, gas burners, and propane burners, and found that gas and propane burners consistently produce significant amounts of benzene, 10 to 25 times more than their coil counterparts. And we found no detectable emissions in induction. Now, finding no benzene emissions in induction stoves is not so surprising. We were a little bit surprised even to find even these small amounts of benzene coming from the coils, and we suspect that's to do just with little bits of dirt or oil landing on that red hot surface. But again, to emphasize, we're talking about an order of magnitude or more benzene coming from gas and propane combustion. So that's interesting and certainly potentially alarming, but the emission rates themselves don't tell us what concentrations people are actually breathing in. They're important to measure because they're the raw material that go into all sorts of indoor air quality models that do model concentration, but they themselves sort of aren't actionable from a health perspective or don't give us a sense of what it means from a health perspective. And so while the emission rates were the core of the study, we also wanted to do some work to investigate what concentrations these emission rates translate into. So we found that in many of the kitchens that we test, turning a single gas or propane burner on high or oven set to 350 for 45 minutes, which is the duration of our measurement, raised benzene concentrations above the baseline. And in about a third of cases, these benzene levels actually exceeded the high estimate of what's found in homes with smokers, according to work from Brett Singer and colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, who looked at benzene in homes with smokers. Another comparison that's not in the paper itself, but that we made and shared it with some press was looking at how these levels compare with readings reported to the EPA around oil refineries. And if we look at oil refineries in California and Colorado, the maximum 1 hour averaged fence line concentrations are on par with many of the concentrations that we measure in kitchens. And if folks want to get into the weeds on the details of that, we can, and I can share plots with that as well. But so that's another interesting comparison we thought to make. I want to emphasize here, there's been some sort of pushback, especially on, well, of course you're going to get high concentrations if you close off the kitchen with plastic, which we do sometimes to measure emission rates. But I want to be very clear, when we're reporting concentrations that we're measuring in kitchens or in other rooms of the house, we're always doing so with no tenting of any kind. So it's a realistic scenario in that way. The tenting is only for the emission rates. So we looked at concentrations in the kitchen, but of course, people aren't always in the kitchen, and we were curious, how does the benzene actually travel throughout the house, especially in the absence of forced air circulation? So in 6 different houses without forced air circulation on, we measured benzene concentrations in the bedroom. And we found that for high emitting ovens, these were all measured with a single oven on for about 90 minutes. So if you're like roasting a chicken or something. In high emitting cases, benzene levels even in the bedroom exceeded California's 8-hour reference exposure levels, and in one case even the acute reference exposure level. I want to emphasize here, these 6 examples were not selected randomly. They were selected sort of to span a range of emissions. So we're not saying this is necessarily representative, but it does give you a sense of what low emitting ovens result in and what high emitting ovens result in. And in many cases, they can exceed these health benchmarks. We also have, for comparison, I want to draw your eye to the lower right-hand corner where we're comparing these concentrations against standards, different countries' standards. These are chronic benchmarks, but certainly if you're having the same cooking pattern day after day, then what we're measuring from a single measurement could certainly become a chronic value. And so that's why we're making that comparison. And as I can see, we're exceeding these thresholds in many cases. And one thing I think it's important to emphasize, with these findings is, as many of you probably know, the EPA is not regulating indoor air quality. But when similar concentrations to the high end of what we observe indoors are observed outdoors, it's a big deal. So we picked 2 examples, one in California, one in Colorado, just because that's where we did our work. Those are the states we did our work, where concentrations on par with the high end of what we measured in bedrooms from stoves prompted a lot of public outcry, media coverage, immediate public investigation from local air quality authorities as to the source. And so I think it's important, in terms of helping form a data-driven narrative about sort of how big a deal or not this is. When these concentrations are found outside, we already agree it's a big deal and is worthy of immediate action. There's another angle to this and another finding, which is, well, what about the food? After all, if burning gas and propane emits benzene, that's bad. But if frying foods emits even more, then maybe that's the lower hanging fruit. In particular, because we found that small amounts of benzene emissions from coils, those red hot coils, likely due to a little bit of grease, we thought it worthwhile to see whether frying foods could actually produce benzene. We picked 2 meals that were previously found to have relatively high levels of particulate emissions, which may correlate with benzene emissions, and found no detectable benzene emissions from these meals. So while it is absolutely true that cooking does produce particulates, when it comes to the benzene, it's the gas, not the food, that's producing benzene. And by the way, I want to say, please feel free to stop me at any point with questions or comments on any of this. So a little bit more on the health context here. I want to stress again, my background is in physics and chemistry, not public health. So I'm borrowing this from oncologists I've spoken with. And some of you all on the call might be more knowledgeable about this end than I am. But just looking at some studies looking at concentrations comparable to what we're measuring. One study found that 4 part per billion benzene was over averaged chronically, was associated with a 60 to 200% increase odds of childhood leukemia, of the worst kind of childhood leukemia. Keep in mind, we're frequently finding gas stoves and ovens contributing to more than a 4 part per billion concentration increase in kitchens and bedrooms. So even if averaged out over time, this kind of increase seems reasonable in many houses. There's another, so that first bullet is a single study, but there are also meta-analyses that come to similar conclusions about these relatively low levels of exposure, low relative to, say, what a worker in a paint or shoe factory would be exposed to, but worrisome nonetheless. So I'm showing 2 meta-analyses that looked at exposure. In one case, directly looking at benzene. In another case, looking at high traffic areas. In both cases, these showed clear increases in the risk of childhood leukemia. In the third case, it's worth pointing out that this did not look specifically at benzene, but rather at traffic emissions overall. It's still worthwhile to look at, though, because benzene is one of the most potent leukemogens among traffic emissions. So these correlations we think still point to the importance of the results. You all may be aware of some talk in the media of benzene coming from stoves that happened a few months ago. So I want to enumerate what's new about this study. PSE Healthy Energy previously led a study that measured benzene and many other hazardous air pollutants present in unburned natural gas. Because we know that stoves leak gas, you can then calculate for various different leak rates and various different benzene concentrations in the underlying gas, how much benzene is the stove leaking. They did so and reported their values, or their modeled leak rates. But this study is the first that actually looked at how much benzene is produced when you're burning the gas. And it's also the first that directly measured benzene emissions rather than modeling them. We found that when the stove is on, you're producing 70 to 640 times more benzene than you would be getting just from a median leak from a stove. So in all but the most extreme of cases where you have an extremely high leak of gas with extremely high levels of benzene, the combustion itself actually produces far more benzene than was present to begin with. And I think this is important because we're talking about 70 to 640 times more benzene. This pushes it into the realm of exceeding a lot of health benchmarks that benzene from leaks alone does not. So that's sort of it's a different difference in quantity for sure. So I'm going to just pause here. I'm at like 11 minutes. There's certainly some backgrounds on like why we should care about stoves and other science, sort of the state of the art of science on stove emissions. I don't know if that's the best use of our time, so I'm just going to pause and see if there's questions on what we have so far. Nina?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for sharing this. I had a question just about, and I may have missed this in the beginning, but I've seen a lot of the statements from EPA and others about benzene being released from stoves does talk about the fact that it's typically poorly vented or faulty stoves that are associated with the benzene leaks. And I don't know if you tested the performance of the stoves during your study in any capacity to sort of address that, or if you think that statement is sort of moot now that you've shown that benzene is released during cooking activity.
Yeah, so I'm if you all can see, I'm pulling up a plot that shows concentrations we measured in kitchens, in different kitchens. Now there are a lot of factors that go into concentrations apart from just the emission rate, the size of the kitchen, etc. But this gives you a sense. And as you can see, different stoves emit different amounts of benzene, and benzene is a product of partial combustion. So it absolutely does suggest that, you could have a stove with perfect combustion where you're not getting much benzene. You are getting NO2, but you're not getting much benzene. So I think that the idea that benzene is coming from something faulty seems reasonable. That said, I want to separate the idea of a faulty stove from ventilation. So that's true. That said, our finding was robust across a bunch of different geographies and a bunch of different stoves. And so semantically, you can say, yes, in these high emitting stoves, there was something faulty. Practically, though, we tried regressions against various different parameters, couldn't find any rhyme or reason for what exactly was causing the high emissions. So it's not like there's some clear actionable fix that we can recommend for how to reduce the benzene emissions. And then for the ventilation issue, yeah, so far I haven't spoken much about ventilation. We've been focusing on the emission rates, which are constant regardless of how much you're ventilating. Obviously, ventilation helps, and we can sort of get into how hood efficacy and how often people use their hoods and all that. But that certainly is important as well. Sorry, got another hand raised. Who was that?
Hey,
Danny?
my name's Danny. Yep. Thanks so much for this info. I was just wondering if there was any kind of noticeable difference or pattern with comparing Colorado to California, and whether there's any reason to think that other states might vary in their performance, and whether there's any plans for additional states testing.
Yeah, so with the relatively widespread of emission rates in the same geography and our sample size, there's no nothing we can really say about emission rates in different geographies. And I don't have any mechanistic reason to think that they would be that different. The big thing that does depend, change with geography are the conditions around the stove. So not in this paper, but subsequently, we've gone to New York, Houston, Melbourne, and looked at both the emission rates, but also the resulting concentrations under different scenarios. And in New York, you can have the same emission rate, but if you're in a tiny apartment in a jurisdiction that does not require code or doesn't require outside venting hoods, and all you have is sort of a studio with a single window, especially if it's smoky outside, the same emission rate is going to translate into a much higher exposure than if you live in a detached single family home somewhere else. So I think, yeah, socioeconomic status and geography as it pertains to what the emissions are going into matters a lot, probably more than the stove itself. There are a few idiosyncrasies, like I can talk about some weird stuff we found in Australia, but I think the big effect is the space into which the pollution is going into, not the stove itself. Stephen, yeah.
I was just curious about, obviously you've done a lot of great work, but what sort of numbers were involved and how many measurements did you make in each test site approximately?
So we went to 87 homes for our emission rate measurements. And if you want, a little bit sort of on the methodology, oversimplifying a bit, but if you close off the kitchen and you measure the concentration increase of benzene over time, and the volume of the kitchen, then that's rough. Then with glossing over a lot of complexities, that you can calculate the emission rate. Our real-time benzene analyzer does 1 point every 15 minutes, and 2 points determine a line. 3 points you can convince yourself is a line most of the time. So we decided, okay, let's do 4 points to get that emission rate. So we did, unless we saw basically zeros, we would do 4 points at every house. Did that? Yeah. You?
Hi, Yannai. Thanks for your presentation. I'm wondering if you guys did any measurements after the active use of the stove. I'm just curious if we have any information about the way that the emissions behave in the space even after the stove is off?
Yeah, so we did. You can see this figure I'm showing now. The left-hand portion of the figure that's white is the oven being on, and the gray portion afterwards, the oven is off, and we're measuring concentrations of the bedroom. So you can see the decay over time, and you can see that the percent, like the rate of decay relative to the peak, is pretty different in different houses, and that's going to depend on the ventilation and also on deposition rates, and a bunch of factors, mostly ventilation and just natural leakiness of the house and deposition. So you can get a little bit of a sense of the spread. That's something that's maybe, it's really laborious to measure in a bunch of different houses. So it's something that we're doing using CONTAM, the NIST indoor air quality model now, to try to do more rigorously, because you can do it in a bunch more different floor plans under different conditions more quickly. But yeah, it depends on a lot of factors. But as you can see, it certainly can linger in the air for quite a while after the stove is off.
Thank you.
Anna Sophia?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
You know, in this working group, we've spent a lot of time talking about gas stoves, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And when we talk about it, usually, now we're like talking about three different things. We're talking about particulates, we're talking about NOx, and now we're talking about benzene. I'm wondering if you could give us your perspective about these three different pollutants and like, why is benzene important in context of those other pollutants? Like, is there a pollutant that we should be more worried about than the other when we're talking about gas stoves? Like, maybe you could give us a little bit context about where to place this benzene concern amongst the concerns around gas stoves.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, that's challenging for me to say, both, someone who's not a public health professional, but from my understanding and my own personal attitude, I find leukemia scarier than asthma, and I think a lot of people do. And we don't have good information yet on sort of the relative odds of the concentrations of each, and how they or at least for benzene, how it pertains to the odd, on a population level, the odds of developing leukemia. We're working on that now. But in terms of, so I don't have sort of the odds component super well figured out on benzene to like feed into my own feelings about it. But in terms of the outcome, like on a more visceral level, I guess, which is maybe not the most scientific, but like I definitely, I find leukemia way scarier than asthma. Now, PM causes all sorts of nasty effects. Benzene is a super potent leukemiogen, more so than PM 2.5. But PM causes more different negative health effects than benzene. So there's a little bit of sort of it's really hard to sort of do a comparison. But for me personally, one of the most potent leukemiogens known to humanity has a certain visceral effect that PM, despite its, sort of the Swiss Army of knife of dangers that it presents, doesn't have quite as much of. It's hard to say.
Thanks. I know that was an impossible question.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll hop in with one now too. I'm curious about what the response has been to this paper and maybe the benzene work as a whole from, the public, maybe the press a little bit, and policymakers even, if you wanted to like go piece by piece there, or if there's a general attitude or reaction to this work.
Yeah, I think you can read the papers if you're interested. I didn't think it was worth putting it on the slide, so I'll just say, so for the public, it's sort of, there's, I would say, like three main responses. There is an immediate, oh my gosh, thanks so much for, this work. Really, I'm so glad you're figuring this out. There's and in some cases followed up by I'm getting rid of my stove, or I'm going out and buying a 2-burner hob or whatever. There is the, oh, huh? Like, okay, really? Come on, like, relax. Like, I've certainly experienced that, just among the public. And then a little bit of like, expressed not directly to my face, but in comments to, various media articles, right? Like, well, I have, the sort of sarcastic, well, I have a new study that, breathing involves in taking oxygen, and oxygen is an oxidant, and oxidant ultimately would kill you, so you shouldn't breathe. So that would be the sort of the range. Not so much of the latter, but a little bit for sure. Media, like legacy media, and certainly like Vox and Canary Media and whatnot, have been, I would say, earnest and interested. And then of course, one thing I thought was interesting was we were written up in the Daily Caller, and they didn't actually. So for a bit of background, sorry, this is going to take a bit. So Eric Labelle, my colleague, was first author on the previous Stokes paper that looked at NO2 emissions, and they're both like gas industry and sort of that ecosystem had a bunch of points on the study itself that they picked apart, some of which I thought were justified, others not. This Daily Caller piece did not talk about the study at all, didn't even misrepresent our tenting procedure at all. They just focused on Richard Lawrence, who made the money to fund the foundation that funds us. That was it, and his China connection or something. I thought that was encouraging, that if they don't have anything on the study, then do an ad hominem. So I found that encouraging. Sorry, and then in policy, we'll see. That's a longer burn. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that intel. I know this group does a lot of communication with folks who are members of the general public, policymakers, the media. So I was interested to hear a little bit about reactions. But any other...
And I'll just say, as I'm sure you all know, like, no one likes to be scared, so it's always good to pair it. And I'm doing the scaring, so look at me. But it's always good to pair it with a carrot.
Absolutely. Well, any other questions from folks before we wrap? We have just a couple of minutes left.
If I could ask a follow-up question, Yannai, around this room and watching this recording, you'll have a lot of people doing advocacy on policy efforts. I'm wondering if you have any advice for us on whether there's anything that you think we should really be focusing on as advocates, whether that's, I'll give you some options, like communications, specific state policy, or engaging more at the federal level. Is there anything that you're wishing advocates were more engaged on related to this topic?
Ooh, that's above my pay grade. I think so I don't know about specifics like stakeholder groups so much. I think there's a lot of both and I don't find myself thinking I don't think to myself in this case, gosh, there's disproportionate effort going here and it really should. I do in other domains, but I don't know, I don't personally, but I do think that like public health folks have done a really great job of generally emphasizing that greenhouse gases are also health pollutants, because climate and health are the same thing. And you should care about both. And I think that's really powerful, and it undercuts the, oh, you're just scaring people about health, but you really care about climate kind of bad faith response. And I would like to see more of that. And I think that people who see themselves more as environmentalists and less as like public health folks don't do that as much. And I'd love to see people who see themselves as environmentalists do more of what the public health folks are doing. personally.
Yeah, great response. Thank you.
Well, we are just at time here, so I think I'm going to go ahead and cut things off. Thank you, Yannai, so much for joining us. For folks who are interested in maybe reading this paper in its entirety, I did link that in our notes document, and I also provided a quick video and a fact sheet that helped boil down some of those main findings. So would definitely recommend checking those out, and we'll share out this recording after it is all processed. But thanks again for joining us, Yannai, and hope you all enjoyed that quick presentation. So we'll see you all next month, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone, for having me. Great to be here.
Thanks so much.
Right.